Some films were harmed in the making of this podcast. From Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and the palatial FYC studio, you are listening to For Your Consideration,
the podcast featuring roundtable discussions re-evaluating the cinematic canon of past masterpieces and modern classics. I'm your host, Dustin.
And I'm Mike Josic, and we'd like to welcome you to the program. If you happen to be listening to the show off of Apple Podcasts, we would love it if you could rate and review the show. 5 stars is always best, but rate what you feel, and it just helps get the podcast into eyes and ears of people who may not know that we're out there. It helps with the metrics. If you're a returning listener, glad you're back, and if you're new to the show, just a heads up, spoilers ahead. So as we stated on our last episode, this time around it was Dustin's pick. We decided to go for a slightly more international flavor and explore a little bit of African cinema, which
is very underrepresented. Even now, even with Nollywood.
And the particular film in question is Ousmane Sembène's 1975 political satirical sex comedy, Xala.
AKA Failure to Launch 2, Electric Boogaloo.
I can see the shame in your face.
There's a lot of shame going around right now. I am not doing my family proud.
So, as I said, Xala was a pick of Dustin's. Dustin, do you want to go at all into the background of why this was your choice?
That seems like you're leading me to do so. Mostly it's that my wife had asked me whether or not we'd done any black films, and I sat there thinking about all the films that we've done over the last several years. And
Kufre, of course, being Nigerian.
And although I don't think she was thinking of African films, probably something from Spike Lee talking about African-American experience, I went that one step further to African films, which, funny enough and ironically enough, she's not actually a fan of.
And it was interesting, you were reading to me off air, because we were talking about just how underrepresented African cinema is, just in general in world cinema, but also as far as the Sight and Sound 2012 list is concerned. But you were reading kind of their mission statement and how with the last list in 2012, they made a concerted effort to go for a more representational route with the people they were contacting and the films that they were hoping to see show up on the list.
Instead of asking a bunch of people from North America and couple places in Europe, they asked all around the world to get a much better representation of worldwide film as opposed to claiming to be worldwide. Kind of like the World Wrestling Federation in America, you know? That's not really the world now, is it? It's one country. Simmer down.
Or the Super Bowl world champions.
To be fair, they are the world champions of football, American football, a sport that only 2 countries care about.
And to be fair, that is genuinely one of the reasons why we switched to the Sight and Sound list, because from the inception of the show, we were kind of working initially off the AFI Top 100.
Which is only American films with only English speaking, with only this kind of budget. It was very precise.
And like single filmmakers had 4 entries on the list, and there may have been only 1 woman. I think Hurt Locker might have been on there. I could be wrong. But yeah, that's one of the opportunities of doing the Sight and Sound list, definitely being able to dip our toes into world cinema. And judging by the response I recently got on Twitter when I posted that I was watching this film, well, let's just say there was a response. We don't usually get that many likes or retweets. It's a pretty placid social media presence. So it's nice to be covering this. I do think it's important to be bringing attention to films like this as well. And that also makes this kind of a complicated little dance.
Because with all that being said, we're a couple of white people talking about African culture in the 70s, which we have no real idea about.
And it did send me, I mean, I had my own sort of gut reaction to the film, which we'll talk about, further on as we go in. It did send me on a bit of a research dive just to kind of familiarize myself a little bit with the context of how, like, not only the time period the film was made in, but the political climate that the film was made in, and a little bit on how the film was made, and being completely... I mean, I think we kind of jokingly mentioned in a previous episode, the only African cinema that we're really aware of is, the movies of Neil Blomkamp, who is from South Africa, filming in Johannesburg. And, take of that what you will. I love Blomkamp, but it's definitely not representative of a very large continent with a lot of people from a lot of different kind of backgrounds.
And honestly, the continent that probably most people in the world know the least about.
Yeah. So that was interesting, and I'm actually kind of grateful for sort of being pushed into that area, because I didn't think it would be fair to be critical of the film without actually sort of educating myself a little bit in that regard. Because, like you said, on a certain level, I feel only qualified to criticize this movie to a certain level.
Which is, of course, a bit of a hint as to where we're going to land, given that, City of God, we both voted masterpiece and had no reason to say otherwise.
And that is something that we will discuss as we move forward. So I'll do the credits quick, and then Dustin, if we can get a quick synopsis of what the story is, and then go into your first impressions. So Xala was directed by Ousmane Sembène. Screenplay was by Ousmane Sembène, and based on his novel of the same name. It was produced by Filmi Domirev SNC. It starred Tierno Lay, Sun Samb, Duta Sek, Yunus Sey. Would it be Seye?
We're going to just apologize right now for all the mispronunciations of these names.
Fatim Diagne and Miriam Niang. Cinematography was by George Caristan Orlando, El Lopez Seydina D. Sey, and Farba Sek. It was edited by Florence Aymon. Music was by Samba Diabara Samb. Distributed by New Yorker Films in the US. Released July 1975 at the Moscow Film Festival. The film is fairly celebrated in critical circles. It is considered an incredibly important film in the oeuvre of African cinema. Sembène himself is regarded by many to also be the father of African cinema, and it's ranked number 83 in Empire Magazine's 100 Best Films of World Cinema.
And it's ranked 283rd on the Critics Poll for the BFI Sight and Sound Greatest Films of All Time 2012, and 546th on the Directors Poll.
So, Dustin, what is the basic breakdown of this political drama about erectile dysfunction?
The basic premise here is that you've got your main character who decides that, well, now that they're finally in charge of their country, which the first scene goes on about how they're finally kicking out these white colonial oppressors, only to start taking money and bribes from them, he decides to celebrate that bribe with a new young wife to bring his total up to 3. Unfortunately, he's not quite able to perform on his wedding night, and spends the rest of his time completely ignoring his family, his work, his crumbling business, everything, just trying to get up and get off. Unfortunately, that doesn't quite work, and he loses everything with his vain attempt to have this proper image of himself as a manly man and restore his virility, until eventually it turns out that his corrupt past has basically caught up to him, and he'd been cursed with the Xala, and now he's lost everything. But maybe at the very end, he gets his virility back. We don't necessarily know, but he did get a little bit of comeuppance. And going into this film, I dearly, dearly, dearly wanted to enjoy it. I've heard great things about the book from a friend of ours. I've heard nothing but good things about Ousmane Sembène to begin with. And I didn't do any research whatsoever into the film itself. So when I went into it, I thought it started a little bit slow with the way they were sort of introducing the government getting kicked out, the white guys getting kicked out. And there's actually only one laugh I had the entire comedy, which is a bad sign to me. And that was when, after being kicked out, the one dude with the mustache walks right back in with those briefcases to offer the bribes to everyone. Just as they were talking about how they were finally going to be in charge of this place themselves. And they had a whole speech going on that I thought drug on a little bit long. And that was really where the film was going to go to me. The pacing was not great, to say the least. But you have to look contextually at just what they were working with in 75 in Senegal. It's not like he had a blockbuster budget. He was trained, as Mike was telling me earlier on, in Russia. So he does have training as a director. But when you start as pretty much the first filmmaker in an entire continent, you don't really have much to work off of. You're not going to have a big pool of great actors to work with. Your technical crew is going to be not super technical. And honestly, I was thinking the other day how it felt very much like Faster Pussycat Kill Kill in terms of the acting, in terms of some of the shooting and all that. So it actually felt like a B movie from the 70s, which is honestly pretty good considering it's coming from a country that most people listening to this have probably never even heard of.
And when you said that to me, like my first reaction was to kind of agree with you because I see where you're coming from and it makes sense. But Faster Pussycat Kill Kill has the advantage of people who had access to, good film and, better post-production facilities so that even like a low-budget American B movie or C movie will still have better production values than kind of what they were working with Xala.
And if you're going to talk about something like that, well, they also didn't have to worry about a government that they were speaking critically of in terms of censorship and what they might be able to get away with.
And even though they were criticizing the colonial government, the French government who were ruling the place, they were also very openly criticizing the post-colonial Senegalese government, the businessmen who took over. I mean, it's pretty scathing. And, you're trying to release this movie, trying to make this movie and release this movie, finance this movie, and you're basically pissing everybody off.
Except for the people who couldn't afford to give you any money whatsoever.
Something that I ran across today, I guess Sembène had been made to do his first film in French as opposed to Wolof. And he apparently didn't translate a lot of the Wolof dialogue in Xala, which was kind of a conscious choice to alienate foreign viewers.
And I can definitely agree with that to an extent. There's a lot of subtitles missing. They'll be talking and talking and there's nothing at the bottom. The only thing I can say about that is the French that I saw, it seemed to be translated well enough at the bottom. And the only things that I could understand were the religious greetings, the Assalamu alaikum and responses to that you would never see any translation for at the bottom. But given that, we don't know how much we might have been missing at this point. I would have expected there to be better subtitles 40, 50 years on of such a seminal work, but it looked like the subtitles were the original ones from the initial release, especially considering they didn't even bother having the subtitles visible in one particular scene out in a garden where he was talking to a businessman, and the subtitles were white on the white clothing and you couldn't read half of them. I could understand what they were talking about. It was just businessy business, but it's definitely not great.
And because I was focusing on the subtitles, I didn't always realize when things were changing from French to Wolof because I'm focusing on the subtitles. And even though I understand a little bit of French, it would be a minute before I would realize, oh, there's a different kind of cadence and the way people are wrapping their mouths around the words, and I'm not recognizing anything anymore.
But there is one extremely important scene which was very telling in the film. And I feel that in the film there's a few really important scenes interspersed with a lot of seemingly nothing. But one of these important scenes was the main character's daughter coming in and having a conversation with him, giving him some crap, and she's speaking in Wolof and he's speaking in French and insisting that she does the same, but she refuses to. She refuses to speak in French, which just goes to show sort of the level of corruption and influence that the colonial governments have had on these businessmen, these people up top, who, even though, yeah, we've got our own stuff now we're in charge, but we're going to keep doing things their way.
They drive European cars, they speak European language.
They drink European drinks, they eat European food. They really try to fashion themselves after these Europeans, in spite of all this claim and talk about finally being their own people again, which is really scathing.
And it's interesting, just to kind of like bring it back to where you were sort of talking and we went off into this sort of contextual thing. It is kind of a satirical sex comedy. I mean, the whole title of the film, Xala, is it's the curse. It's the erectile dysfunction curse that this guy's been kind of put under. And that's kind of the thing the whole thing hangs on. But in every other way, I mean, this movie really does seem to set out to kind of annoy or piss off everyone on some level. I mean, even if you want to talk about just there's the language, there's the politics, there's the gendering, very strong, very aggressive women, very kind of weak, depowered men, emasculated men. So yeah, that's just kind of put a bow on the sort of contextualizing of this.
And there are some scenes that I don't know if they were supposed to be sillier than we'd expect, when he's trying to do all these different things to try and get his virility back, where he crawls in some weird mask and whatnot, scares the crap out of his third wife. He's like, what the hell's going on here? This guy coming at me on all fours. And he goes to everybody. Everybody's all got these promises about, oh, I can cure this, I can cure this, I can cure this. And you'll get that interspersed with scenes saying that, hey, so we need some money to do some stuff with over here. He's like, no, don't even worry about it. I got other stuff to worry about. Get the heck out of here. I'm in charge. And everything just keeps falling flat for him because he's focused on this effectively completely unimportant thing and just letting the world crash down around him. All of which is pure political commentary. And in the meantime, there's sort of a little side story that starts with, you've got a bunch of beggars, most of whom have like missing legs. They're sort of crippled in one way or another, that were hanging out outside of his compound. And he's like, get those people out of here. We don't need to see them. They're making us look bad. And so they're shooed off. And throughout the film, for a while, you see them being sort of shuffled from place to place, just wandering through the desert with this weird, wacky music, which is kind of odd.
Well, did the police like load them up into a van and drive them out and just like dump them at the edge of town in the desert?
Pretty much.
And there's this weird odyssey of them working their way back,
and
which culminates at the end of the movie.
And they're met up by another guy who is robbed in the town. It's a very small side story where he came into town in order to use the money, everyone's money, to get some supplies that were needed for the town to survive. Now, he's pickpocketed by somebody, and he meets up with these beggars later on, and he's having a meal with them, and he explains his situation, and they say, well, why don't you go back to town? And it's like, well, this way they can always have hope. They can just assume that I died or something like that. And it's like, I feel like this is supposed to be important, but I am not getting it. I know that I'm not getting it, but I feel that there's a lot more to his comments that is probably cultural.
I don't know if you remember, because you saw this movie a lot farther back than I did, but the guy who pickpocketed that guy, I think he's the person, once El Haj gets like ejected from the chamber, I think he's the guy that gets introduced as the new person to be part of the government. Because now he's got all this money.
That would make sense.
And I didn't bother to go back and check, but it does kind of make sense, and it is kind of funny. So I feel like that probably is true. And I like it better than if he's not. So I'm going to stick with that no matter what.
Sounds like a plan.
You brought up the technical aspects of this movie, and I kind of was dancing around the criticisms of this movie. And it's sort of why I wanted to start also with talking about the intent of the film and the artistic aspirations of the film. On a technical side, this movie's really bad. The talent pool that they're pulling from, editing, the length of the shots, the style of the shots, the staging, the blocking, the props, the costumes, the sets, like, this is either some serious guerrilla filmmaking, and I kind of hope it is, because it's the third film. It's Sembène's third film, and he's adapting his own novel, so he's got to know the story. And I haven't seen Black Girl, and I haven't seen It's called like Maladu or something. I have to think that because he's making these politically charged films, financing is not going to come easily necessarily from the government that he's criticizing. They don't have a thriving film industry that has the ability to just kind of... It's not France, they're not like government funding like all of this art. And they're probably making do with a lot of just what they have around. That was, I think, my biggest struggle with the movie. And I get the feeling that was probably your biggest struggle as well.
Honestly, I find it easy to forgive that kind of thing. The issue I had was entirely plot related. You can have any sort of technical issues whatsoever, but I expected so much from the plot itself. Bad actors saying good lines sort of deal is what I was expecting. But the pacing becomes a large issue.
There's so many scenes where it's like somebody sits down and opens a briefcase and you get every second of them entering the room and sitting down and opening the briefcase and pulling out what's inside. And there's no editing and the camera doesn't move. And the other actor is just kind of sitting there looking awkward, waiting for the point where they're supposed to say their lines. It kills all the pacing. There's so many scenes that just go on. They're showing too much. Like there's no trimming for pace.
And then, of course, with subtitles missing, they're simultaneously not showing enough, which is a fun little irony going on there.
And even in like the dialogue scenes, like a lot of times there'll be these pauses between one actor saying something and the other actor saying something, and it's like an awkward pregnant pause. So one character will be like, "So Dad is really cranky. What is wrong with Dad?"
Oh, he's not feeling too well today.
I think you jumped in a little too fast.
I apologize, sir.
And it had a very staged feeling. It felt... I was joking. It took me a while to get through this movie, if I'm being honest. And I watched it
in two halves myself.
Yeah, and I remember joking to you at one point, and I said I was going to be a lot harsher on the film and say that it felt like this was Senegalese community theater, because it kind of had that sort of quality. I was hoping for something like a little bit more robust.
Which is where I felt a lot like Faster Pussycat Kill Kill to me, where the three actresses there are just shouting all the time. On the other hand, I live with an African. There's a lot of shouting. That's just how they talk. Granted, her language is also tonal, so a tonal language has more shouting, which is why a lot of people here might think that like Chinese or East Asian people are shouting a whole lot. It's a tonal language. You have to get that sort of level for it to mean a different thing. And it's something that we don't understand.
And you mentioned like early at the top of the episode that this is 1975. This is a culture we're very unfamiliar with, even sort of just tangentially. Like we probably have more in common or are more culturally attuned to like Japanese culture or Indian culture or, well, most European cultures. More so than the cultures of any African nation. So I'm sure there's stuff that's kind of being sort of lost in translation. And even with my sort of brief dive into researching some of the background and context of it, what I look at as weird stilted acting, it might feel a little bit more natural.
Not from the other African films I've seen.
Okay.
They talk a lot faster. There's a lot more going on at all times.
Okay, so you're saying this... Because I haven't... Like I said, my experience with African cinema is pretty much just Blumkamp.
No, I've seen several Nollywood films. I've overheard a co-worker watching whatever drama in... Honestly, I couldn't tell you exactly where it was from, but a Southern African state, just because he's from a few. Either way, so I've seen it from a few different regions. Yeah, normally there's not that stilted talking. It does not happen. That is a community theater sort of B-grade acting.
Fair enough. And I wanted to be sensitive to that just because...
You never know.
You never know. And I mean, where this film sits and what this film represents, it is important. And it is, again, like we said at the top of the episode, it's a seminal film in African cinema.
What it's talking about is important, and honestly, from everything I keep hearing, still issues that are abound today. You were saying before the show that Ousmane wouldn't say that it was a post-colonial film, that it was meta-colonial, because colonialism hasn't ended. It's still there. It's still causing these problems.
In fact, it's working better now. The colonial goals are being achieved more successfully now than they were when the colonial powers were in power.
And I hear about that kind of corruption in other places as well. So it's still an important film today in terms of what's actually occurring from everything that I hear.
And the themes and the ideas and the satire and like all that stuff is really on point, and it's really interesting. And when you hear somebody talk about the film, like when you first told me what the movie was about, it was kind of intriguing. It's like, hey, it's this kooky bigamist who's like this corrupt government guy, and he's got to like figure out how to get his groove back. And I'm like, okay, where's this gonna go? And I've seen reviews of the book, and I know you know somebody who's read the book, and like good
They all
reviews
speak highly, very highly.
speak highly of the book.
Honestly, I'm interested in reading the book to see just sort of how it compares. Because usually you can get away with a lot more in writing. You don't need quite as many people to be to have your back to write something.
And to a certain extent, I dislike the fact that I have to kind of struggle with this, but I also am glad that I have to struggle with this, because this is really part of the mission statement of having these discussions. I mean, we don't do like crazy deep dive analyses on films, but just trying to sort of not only interrogate the films, but interrogate how we engage with the films. Because something like this, I could just say it was bad community theater, but that's not fair. I don't think that's fair to critique it that way, even though I think that is definitely a part of this film. And I also don't want to give it too much credit.
Exactly. You don't want to start talking it up so much that if somebody were to see it and be like, well, there's a lot of quality issues here, you got to address it. It's the elephant in the room. So it's got a dichotomy that's kind of tricky to look at, especially as a couple white people talking out of their asses about African cinema from 50 odd years ago.
Oh shit, it is 50 years ago, isn't it?
Just about your age right there, sir.
Shh. I did find it interesting that at the time the colonial powers were using media as a projection of what sort of they considered to be proper, and to sort of whitewash things in the sense of this is what we approve of, and you know, this other stuff is not good. And they were very much in control of visual representations of things. And so when people like Sembène were starting to kind of make films, they were kind of reclaiming that visual language, and they were being transgressive with it by sort of turning it on its head and making it more representational and more, you know.
And it would be tricky because film at that point would have been a European language that he's trying to use to convey his own ideas.
And he was mentored in Russia, and the financing would be coming from weird places, and sometimes they would have to take financing from the people who they were being critical of in order to make the movie to criticize.
I mean, hopefully he got some sort of sponsorship from whatever bottled water company the guy was using to wash his car and do absolutely everything, because heaven forbid he drink Senegalese water.
So I find that really fascinating, the sort of recapturing, or not recapturing, but reclaiming like a visual vocabulary, and being sort of aggressive and transgressive, and sort of rewriting that. I don't want to use the word vocabulary again. But rewriting that narrative. And the distribution also of the films was mainly from European sources, because there was no distribution set up within Africa. So it was like you had America, you had Europe, and when you're making films that are scathingly critical of those governments and those systems, finding distribution, and you're making essentially really uncommercial films, and you're trying to get commercial distribution for them. So they're working under really particular circumstances. And how do you realize your vision without compromising your vision when you're seeking financing and distribution from compromising sources, and just kind of staying true to all that. So it's an interesting part of the whole recipe that I wanted to include earlier, but I'm assuming that there's probably some people who've come to this who are familiar with this film and maybe familiar with some of the history. And I'm also taking this opportunity to throw some stuff out for people who are coming to this cold and may not know stuff. And this is the extent of what I've learned in the last few days.
And another thing that has to do with those big important scenes, since we might as well talk about those big important scenes. You've got, of course, the scene at the beginning with the handover of power, which wasn't really a handover of power. You've got the scene with him talking to his daughter and the difference between his corrupt colonial self and her resistance to that and her attempt to stay more traditional. You've also got the scene at the very end, which seemed to come really out of left field to me, because he's about to get kicked out of the parliament and he just starts going off on this whole speech about how they're all a bunch of corrupt assholes just like him, so none of them have any right to question anything that he does. And it's like, where did this come from?
Well,
it's true, but geez.
He was writing bad checks. He took the money that he got from a corrupt deal to basically finance his third wedding, and he'd been writing bad checks, and people were complaining about the government. So he was giving the government kind of a bad name. And like the president, I thought it was interesting. The president was backing up, supporting him in his like search to reclaim his virility. Like the president of the country is backing his quest. Because you were talking about how so much of the film was taken up with like this ridiculous search.
His quest for a boner.
But, well, there you go. That could have been a dumbery right there. Yeah, I mean, they're essentially trying to kick him out because he's reflecting poorly on them. And he's kind of saying, like, you're kicking me out. Like, you're just the same as me. You've all written bad checks, too. You're all just as corrupt as me.
To which they're basically like, yeah, but nobody's complaining about us. We haven't been caught, so... So
they clean house. They boot him. They take all their assets. They take his car. That ridiculous scene where they're pushing the Mercedes. Can you drive a Mercedes? No. Can you drive a Mercedes? No. Can you drive a Mercedes? No. And the guy gets in the car and they just push the Mercedes.
And the last thing they're definitely worth commenting on is in any scene where you see the president, there's always that mustached white guy just standing behind him. Doesn't say anything, but he's always there. Right from the beginning of the film.
I feel like a lot of the ending was kind of out of left field. Like the home invasion by the beggars and the homeless people that just finally made their way back into town. And then they're like attacking him. Like they just show up.
And then it turns out well, not them, but one of the guys associated with them is in charge of the curse. And in order to get his virility back, he's got to do one final thing to sort of prove himself almost.
They want to humiliate him. One final humiliation. And they say, you've lost everything. You strip naked. You let us spit on you. Which apparently does have some sort of tie to some sort of ritual that is not regularly practiced.
And then apparently they all ate a bunch of chalk before spitting on him because, man, their saliva was white and thick.
Super white. I don't know if that's symbolic.
I think it's just so that it showed up on film.
But it's also, I agree. It's also weird because his family emptied his house and were like moving out and they all get in a truck and they drive away. But then they're all at the house when there's the home invasion and they're there to witness his final degradation.
Well, they pushed his wife or daughter into the other room and I was like, are they going to assault her? Like, what the hell's going on here?
I wondered that too. And it seemed to be going there and then it didn't.
Thankfully.
And there's also, like, the women, the three wives play such a huge role.
Well, the first two and the mother of the third.
There's so much of a female presence in this film until there just isn't. Once things start falling apart, the women just fall away. There's the last scenes where they all come and kind of collect money from him because they need to pay bills, they need to do whatever. And kind of once that happens, you just sort of watch everything fall apart. You find his business dealings going under. You find his sexual stuff like going to hell, his government position, losing friends, losing position, losing all that stuff. It was weird. It was weird to just like have the wife show up again for me. Like, I think a lot of things were abrupt at the end. So you're not wrong in feeling that way.
Thank you for your validation.
Your feelings, your feelings matter, Dustin.
Well, we'll see if the audience agrees.
After the record, Dustin and I are going to have a long embrace.
Hands will slowly fall down the back. Grab a butt.
This is starting to feel Deadpool-y. Tummy to tummy, pelvis to pelvis. So, I don't think I have anything more to say about the movie. Have we skipped over anything that you wanted to address?
In terms of movie plot points or any of the production or anything like that, I think we've sort of hit most of it. I know you're talking a bit about the music earlier on in some of your research.
Yeah, there's something about the use of the music. Again, I regret that I don't have the exact sort of facts nailed down. But the band that was being used, they were apparently a band at the time who were kind of a fusion of sort of traditional music and newer style of music. And I can't remember if they were popular or not, but I do remember some of the commentary that I went through was talking about it being significant for the film.
Metatextually, like that's talking about colonialism coming in and sort of taking over the traditional values, mixing it. Regardless of which one wins out, it's that the old is being supplanted in some way. Just that there was some thought that went into it that shows that Ousmane knows what he's doing, but might just not have the means and the financing to get it done in the way that he was hoping for, or in the way that we might hope for.
And possibly at the time may not have had the technical skill or the access to material or facilities to make a better film on a technical level.
Which is why...
But I still heavily question his editing choices.
Well, as you said, he was trained in Russia. Maybe that's how Russian films are. I haven't seen Russian films from the 70s.
I've seen a few reviews, and I don't know why this is. I need to do a little bit more digging to find out why. But this movie being compared to Stalker, Tarkovsky's Stalker, and they'll give the movie like a review where like this movie on its own, this movie as compared to Stalker. Or I would rather watch this movie than have to like watch 5 minutes of Stalker. Or like there seems to be this weird binary between the two, or connection or competition or some sort of friction. And I'm wondering if it's being taught in schools. I've yet to see Stalker. It's definitely on my list. All the images I've seen of it it looks incredible, but it is a long film. Anyways, I'll bet you it's being taught in schools where these two films are being held up as an example of something. And people who have seen both films are now like going on Letterboxd and reviewing and complaining.
Looking at all of that as a whole, and I don't think I would ever want to see this film ever again, though I am now interested in reading the novel and checking out some more of Ousmane's oeuvre. I speak French, so I shouldn't be struggling that much with that word, but that's life.
Well, in this context, it is the colonial language, so.
I couldn't, with good conscience, give it a masterpiece, but very much as a seminal piece, as a piece that's as important as it is culturally and historically, and one that is still of value today in terms of the content, even though that content wasn't given to us in a way that I'd consider masterful. It's definitely something that's worthy of being in a museum. Something that's worth looking at for people looking at the histories of film, at the history of African film, at the history of Africa, quite frankly, because this is something that is still valid today. Even though if I were to show my wife this film, she'd be bored out of her mind in under 5 minutes. And to be fair, that applies to about 50% of any films that I show her. In 5 minutes, she's like, let's watch something else. I'm like, they haven't started yet. Let them at least get somewhere before you get bored.
Doesn't matter what country it's from.
To be fair, it might just be that I'm choosing something. Sometimes I get that feeling and it's a little upsetting, you know. She chooses something, that's an entirely different discussion. But yes, I would definitely throw Xala into the museum piece category. Firmly and solidly.
When I first experienced this film, the process of watching this film, as I said, I was making jokes about it being community theater, and it was kind of disappointing considering the place that it sort of holds in the history and the context of African cinema.
You hear so many good things about something, you hold it up to a level. If it does not make it there, you're extra harsh on it.
And you
I heard so much good about Citizen Kane that I will never consider it a good film because it does not live up.
And you mentioned that the book was really good, that you knew somebody who thought the book was really good, and I went and I checked some reviews, and also saying the book was really good, and the film is adapted by the guy who wrote the book. So I had hopes, and they were kind of dashed somewhat. And I was at one point going to pull out the sort of rare option of just voting this film off the island. But then I thought that was not really fair, and you know, I'm always willing to accept that there's sort of something that I'm missing and that I need to do a little bit more work. That whole thing about interrogating, you know, my engagement with it as well as the film's merits as a piece of cinematic art.
And as a piece of cinematic history.
Yeah. Once I kind of like did the dive and learned a little bit more, I had to basically accept, well, that makes it sound like I did it reluctantly. I was happy to acknowledge that this film is a museum piece. This is an important film. It's a seminal film. The things that it was saying, things that it is saying, as Dustin said, like a lot of this is still relevant today. Even though I think the film may not technically be very masterful or even very good, I do think that what it is and where it is, and I don't think I make this call very often, because I like to try and let films stand on their own merits and not be like, well, you know, they didn't have this or they didn't have that, and it kind of plays into it. But especially when we're dealing with like masterpiece,
I'd say when it comes to being a masterpiece, that stuff has to be there. But museum piece, there's other qualities that can be extraneous, other stuff that you weren't aware of that could determine that factor.
But it's also a situation, you know, going back again to the top of the episode where we talked about how criminally underrepresented so much world cinema is, and particularly African cinema. I mean, I think you went through the list and you counted 5?
I counted somewhere from 5 to 7, but of those, I think Xala might have been the only one that was actually produced, actually made by an African. Other ones would be, okay, yeah, this one, it's a African film that just happens to be entirely in English because it's about an English person's experience on this farm in Africa. It's not an African film.
It's not expressing the culture and the people, and it's an outside perspective looking in.
It's like Blood Diamond. It's like
yeah.
District 9 would be a better example because at least there it has some commentary on African culture, sort of wrapped up in aliens.
Yeah, it's got a like really strong kind of like apartheid vibe. And like the shanty towns and stuff like that. But yeah, I wanted to make sure that in a case like this, a film where it's culturally underrepresented in world cinema, and it's a film very early in sort of the development of the cinema of Senegal and African cinema in general, I felt it deserved a little bit more consideration in that respect, and that's why I'm very happy and comfortable to give it a museum piece. A little disappointed that I can't give it a masterpiece, because
as I said, I can forgive crappy cinematography and all that stuff, because I mean, Troll 2 I'd still call a masterpiece of the so good it's bad film sort of industry. There's other films which don't have much going on for them, low budget, simple sort of films. Dead Shack, low budget film, but still done very proficiently. You could even, I didn't care for Blair Witch a whole heck of a lot, but you can do a lot with very little. He unfortunately did not do a whole lot with what little he had. And looking at the film just independently of all else, it's not really a good film. You have to look at it with some context. You have to focus more on the potential of it, on the messages that are being given, not necessarily how they're given, which is always going to be a problem, and that's always going to knock it off that masterpiece pedestal. But I sure as heck am not going to vote it off the island, unlike some other crap things that aren't even films, like 2001.
Don't go there.
A Long Day's Night.
It just makes people angry, Dustin.
Bring it. Bring your anger. Basically, don't go into it expecting a cinematic masterpiece, expecting a bit of a slog that will have some meaning and will require some thought.
And maybe go into it with a spirit of exploration. Maybe you see this film and maybe you want to see Black Girl. Maybe you want to read the book. Maybe you want to, explore other African cinema. Check out some Nollywood films, some Gollywood films. Who knows where it'll take you? Might be a crazy rabbit hole.
Personally, it would be interesting to see one of those conversations Ousmane must have had with some politician or businessman. Hey, could I have 100,000 native monies in order to call you an impotent idiot? Thanks.
Just piss everybody off. So there you have it. That was our discussion of the 1975 satirical, political sex comedy, Xala. I'm kind of glad we had an opportunity to bring that movie to discussion, as much as painful as it was kind of to watch. Some people may feel that our next film might be just as painful.
I disagree.
I disagree too. I'm actually looking forward to what we're going to do in March. It's going to be 2 episodes, actually. One of them is going to be a special conversations episode where I talk with composer Mark Snow, who many people probably know from X-Files, Smallville. He also did the score for The New Mutants, which is the film that we're going to talk about. We're going to do a quick little All Things Considered episode, a little movie review, a little music interview, and that'll be our March.
That will be our April. So we look forward to seeing you then.
Sorry, yes, it's April. That's our April. You are listening to this in March. We are recording it in February.
And we're transposing it into the future through the magic of technology. We have the power.
But we're not going to share it.
You'll have to fight us for it, which will be hard because we're living in the past right now. Ooh. Good luck catching up.
So we're interested to hear what you guys have to say. Have you seen the film? What do you think of the film? What did you think of our discussion / commentary / history of the film?
And most importantly, have any of you read the book and seen the film? Because I want to know what you have to say about a comparison between the two.
Yeah. Hit us up on our YouTube comment wall. Is that what it's called? Most of our comments come through YouTube. You can also hit us up on Facebook. We are also on Twitter at FYC Show. While you're there, like, follow, share, subscribe, share amongst your friends and family on social media. If you dig it, let other people know that we're out there. Word of mouth is a powerful tool, and we have no compunctions about weaponizing it. So with that, I don't think there's really anything else to add. Join us next time for New Mutants and Mark Snow interview. And until then, I have been your host, Mike Josic.
And I've been your other host, Dustin Friesenham.
Take care, and we'll see you next time on For Your Consideration.
Adieu et bonsoir. It was in 2 languages. French. I don't know.